"She's lovely, Chris," Nancy said, tracing the rim of her wineglass, her voice low and dangerously smooth. "But she doesn't understand you. Not the way I do." I froze, my keys halfway to the hook. The scent of Ionalia's perfume was still fading from my jacket, the memory of our first date warm in my mind. "Nancy, She stepped closer, the soft silk of her robe brushing my arm. "Tell me, Chris," she whispered, her eyes dark. "Does she know what you're really hiding in that locked drawer?" Chris Gay pushed open the heavy oak door of his apartment building, shaking the worst of the moisture from his umbrella. It had been a good night. Better than good, actually. His date with Ionelia Andrew had been a rare spark of genuine connection in a year defined by grey monotony. Ionelia, with her bright laugh and eyes the colour of strong tea, had listened to him talk about his struggling architectural firm without glancing at her watch once. They had shared a plate of overly expensive calamari and talked until the restaurant started stacking chairs on tables. He could still smell her perfume, something floral and bright contrasting sharply with the damp wool of his coat. He trudged up the 2 flights of stairs to his apartment, the worn carpet swallowing the sound of his footsteps. The building, a Victorian relic Nancy Kermakova had inherited and stubbornly refused to modernize, creaked in the wind. Nancy, his landlady. She lived in the sprawling unit on the ground floor, a woman whose exact age was a mystery wrapped in tailored silk blouses and expensive, subtle perfume. Chris reached his door, fumbling for his keys. It was then he noticed the light spilling from under the gap. He frowned. He was fastidious about turning lights off, a habit born of tight budgets. He pushed the door open. Nancy was sitting in the armchair by the window, a glass of dark red wine in her hand. The only light came from the small lamp beside her, casting long, dramatic shadows across her elegant features. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Nancy?" Chris paused in the doorway. "Is everything all right? Did a pipe burst again?" "No pipes, Chris," she said, her voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. "I just needed a moment of quiet. Your apartment always feels so peaceful." It was an odd statement, given he was paying her for the space, but Nancy had always blurred the lines of the landlord-tenant relationship. She brought him homemade soup when he was sick, remembered his birthday with vintage architectural books, and occasionally, like tonight, let herself in. He had given her a spare key for emergencies, a decision he sometimes questioned. "I was just getting back," Chris said, feeling the need to explain himself, a sudden awkwardness settling over him. He hung his coat on the rack, acutely aware of the lingering scent of Ionelia. "I know," Nancy murmured, taking a slow sip of her wine. "You were with someone, a woman. You have that flush about you, the one people get when they think they've found something new." Chris felt his face heat up. "Yeah, I had a date. It was nice." "Nice," Nancy repeated, the word sounding inadequate, almost mocking on her tongue. She stood slowly, the movement fluid and graceful. She was wearing a deep emerald robe that seemed to swallow the dim light. She walked toward him, stopping just close enough that he could smell her signature scent. Sandalwood and something sharp, like crushed pine needles. "She's lovely, Chris," Nancy said, tracing the rim of her wineglass, her voice low and dangerously smooth. "But she doesn't understand you. Not the way I do." Chris froze, his keys halfway to the hook. The memory of Ionalia's warm smile felt suddenly distant, replaced by the intense, unsettling focus in Nancy's eyes. "Nancy, He stepped back slightly, bumping into the coat rack. She stepped closer, closing the distance he'd just created. The soft silk of her robe brushed against his arm. "Tell me, Chris," she whispered, her eyes dark and searching. "Does she know what you're really hiding in that locked drawer in your desk?" The air left Chris's lungs in a rush. The drawer, the one he kept locked, the key hidden inside the spine of a fake dictionary. How did she know? The silence that followed Nancy's question was heavy, suffocating. Chris stared at her, trying to read the intention behind her perfectly composed expression. "I don't know what you're talking about," he managed to say, his voice lacking conviction. Nancy smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. "Oh, Chris, don't lie to me. Not to me." She reached out, her fingertips lightly grazing the lapel of his jacket. "I know about the letters, the blueprints, the plans for the San Miguel project." Chris felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. Mats San Miguel. The name was a ghost he'd been trying to bury for 3 years. Mats had been his mentor, his business partner, and the man who had nearly ruined his life before dying in a mysterious car accident. The locked drawer contained the only copies of the designs Mats had been working on. Designs that were brilliant, revolutionary, and completely stolen from a rival firm headed by a man named Zbynek Weber. "How do you know about that?" Chris demanded, his tone sharpening. He dropped his keys onto the small console table with a clatter. Nancy moved away, walking back toward the armchair. She didn't sit down, instead picking up a framed photograph from his side table, a picture of Chris and Mats taken at a gala years ago. "Because I know Mats," she said simply, tracing the glass over Mats's face. "I knew him long before you did." Chris's mind raced. Mats had never mentioned Nancy. He had found this apartment through a generic listing. It had seemed like a stroke of luck finding something affordable in this neighborhood. Had it been a setup? "You knew him?" Chris asked, stepping further into the room. "How? Why didn't you ever say anything?" Nancy turned to face him, the sad smile back. "Because you were grieving, because you needed a safe harbor, and I wanted to provide one." Mats was complicated. He was brilliant, yes, but he was careless with people. She set the photo down gently. "Careless with you, certainly, and careless with me. Were you two—" Chris trailed off, unsure how to finish the question. "Lovers?" Nancy supplied, her laugh dry and brittle. "For a time, until he found someone younger, someone more easily manipulated. Isis Warren." The name landed like a physical blow. Isis Warren, Mats's widow, the woman who had inherited everything, including the debts Mats had hidden from Chris. Isis, who had smiled tearfully at the funeral while holding the arm of Zbynek Weber. "Isis," Chris repeated, feeling nauseous. "Yes," Nancy said softly. "The Black Widow herself. She's the reason he's dead, Chris. You must suspect that." Chris sank onto the edge of his sofa, the adrenaline of the date completely gone, replaced by a deep, familiar anxiety. He had suspected it, of course. Mats was an excellent driver. The accident report had cited mechanical failure, but the car had been brand new. But suspecting and proving were two different things, and Chris had been too focused on keeping his own head above water to dig into it. "Why are you telling me this now?" Chris asked, looking up at her. "Why wait 3 years?" Nancy moved to sit beside him on the sofa, the emerald silk pooling around her legs. "Because of tonight," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because you brought that girl's scent into this house. You're trying to move on, to build a normal life. But you can't, Chris. Not until the past is settled. And not with someone who doesn't understand the darkness you're carrying." She reached out, taking his hand. Her fingers were cool and strong. "I understand it, Chris. Because I carry it too." Sleep was impossible that night. Chris lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain tap against the glass. Nancy's words echoed in his head, twisting around the memory of Ionelia's bright smile. He felt caught between two worlds, the promising, normal future Ionelia represented, and the tangled, dangerous past Nancy had just dragged into the present. The next morning, the city was washed clean, but Chris felt grimier than ever. He arrived at his small office, a converted loft space he shared with another struggling architect, Łukasz Brodin. Łukasz was already there, hunched over his drafting table, a half-eaten bagel beside him. "Morning, sunshine," Łukasz grunted, not looking up from his tablet. "You look like you slept on a bed of nails." "Something like that," Chris muttered, dropping his bag onto his desk. He glanced at the locked drawer. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy now. "How was the date with the tea-coloured eyes?" Łukasz asked, finally swiveling his chair around. "Ionelia, right?" Chris forced a smile. "It was great, really great. We're going to see each other again." Łukasz whistled low. "Wow, Gay is back in the game. It's a miracle." Chris wanted to talk to Łukasz. He wanted to tell him about Nancy, about Mats, about the stolen designs. But Łukasz was a straightforward guy. He designed practical, functional spaces. He didn't deal well with drama, and he certainly wouldn't understand the sudden, bizarre turn Chris's life had taken. He spent the morning trying to focus on a design for a local bakery renovation, but his mind kept drifting to Zbynek Weber. Weber's firm, Zenith Architecture, was everything Chris's wasn't: sleek, corporate, ruthlessly successful. If Mats had stolen the San Miguel project designs from Weber, and Isis was now somehow connected to Weber, the implications were terrifying. Around noon, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Ionelia. "Thinking about last night. Coffee later? My treat this time." Chris smiled, a genuine feeling of warmth spreading through him. He typed back a quick, "Yes, definitely," feeling a sudden, desperate need to see her, to anchor himself to something simple and good. He met her at a small cafe near her office. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat that made her look like a splash of sunshine against the grey cityscape. "You look tired," she said immediately, as he sat down, concern knitting her brows. "Just a long night," Chris evaded. "Work stuff." Ionelia studied him for a moment, sipping her latte. "You know, you can talk to me, right? Even if it's just boring work stuff." Chris felt a pang of guilt. "I know, it's just complicated." "I like complicated," she smiled gently. "Try me." He opened his mouth to tell her, maybe not everything, but something. Before he could speak, however, a shadow fell over their table. "Chris Gay," a smooth, overly cultivated voice purred. "I thought that was you." Chris looked up. Standing there, holding a bespoke leather briefcase and wearing a suit that cost more than Chris's car, was Zbynek Weber. "Weber," Chris said, his voice tight. He stood up slowly, positioning himself slightly between Weber and Ionelia. "It's been a while since the funeral," Weber said, his eyes flicking dismissively toward Ionelia before settling back on Chris. "I hear your little firm is still struggling along." "We're doing fine," Chris said flatly. "Good, I'm glad." Weber smiled, a shark-like baring of teeth. "I was actually hoping to run into you soon. We have some unfinished business regarding Matz's estate, some intellectual property that seems to have gone missing." The cafe noise seemed to fade away. Chris felt the cold sweat return, stronger this time. Nancy was right. The past wasn't settled. "I don't know what you're talking about," Chris lied smoothly, holding Weber's gaze. Weber chuckled softly. "We'll see, Chris. We'll see." He tapped the table twice, a menacingly casual gesture, and walked away. Chris slowly sat back down, his hands trembling slightly. He looked across the table at Ionelia, whose tea-coloured eyes were now wide with confusion and alarm. "Chris," she whispered. "Who was that? And what did he mean by missing property?" Before Chris could answer, his phone buzzed again. It wasn't a text. It was an email, a single image file sent from an unknown address. He opened it. It was a photo of Chris and Ionelia sitting at this exact table, taken from across the street just moments ago. Attached was a brief message. "She doesn't belong in our world, Chris. Tell her to run." Chris stared at the photo on his screen, his blood turning to ice water. He quickly clicked the phone off, shoving it into his pocket before Ionelia could lean over the table. Her tea-coloured eyes were wide, darting between the spot where Zbynek Weber had just stood and Chris's pale face. "Chris," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "What is going on? Who was that man? And why did you look like you were about to be sick when you looked at your phone?" "It was nothing," Chris lied, the words tasting like ash. He forced a smile that felt entirely alien on his face. "Just a spam message, a badly timed one. And that guy, just an old rival of my former business partner. He likes to throw his weight around, tries to intimidate the smaller firms. It's corporate nonsense, Ionelia. Nothing for you to worry about." She didn't look convinced. She folded her arms over her bright yellow raincoat, her brow furrowed. "Corporate nonsense doesn't make a person's hands shake, Chris. I'm not fragile. You can tell me." God, he wanted to. He wanted to reach across the small cafe table, take her warm hands in his, and pour out the whole insane story. Matt's, the stolen blueprints, Nancy's creepy midnight confession, and the terrifying photo he had just received. But the message had been clear. She doesn't belong in our world. Tell her to run. Whoever had sent it, Weber, Nancy, or someone else entirely, was using Ionelia as leverage. "I promise you," Chris said, keeping his voice steady with a monumental effort. "It's just work stress. Look, I should get back to the office. Ukash is probably drowning in the bakery renovations." He stood up, dropping a $20 bill on the table to cover the coffees. "I had a really great time last night, Ionelia. I really did." "But?" she asked, catching the finality in his tone. "No buts," he said softly, breaking his own heart as he forced distance between them. I have a lot on my plate right now. I'll call you, okay?" He didn't wait for her to answer, turning and practically fleeing the cafe into the grey, drizzling afternoon. He felt her eyes on his back until he turned the corner. When Chris returned to the loft office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Ukas was standing near the drafting tables, his arms crossed, looking remarkably uncomfortable. Sitting in the lone visitor's chair was a woman Chris had hoped never to see again in person. Isis Warren. Mats's widow was dressed in a tailored charcoal grey suit that screamed wealth. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, and her sharp, beautiful features were perfectly composed. Beside her stood a woman Chris didn't recognize, a tall, severe-looking woman with a blunt bob and piercing blue eyes holding a notepad. "Chris," Isis purred, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "It's been far too long." "Isis," Chris said, dumping his wet coat on the rack. "What are you doing here, and who is this?" "Detective Marine Schlosser," the tall woman said, flashing a silver badge before tucking it away. "Major crimes. I'm here because Mrs. Warren requested I accompany her. We're taking a second look at the circumstances surrounding Matt San Miguel's fatal accident." Chris's stomach dropped. "A second look? The police report said it was mechanical failure. Reports can be amended when new evidence comes to light," Detective Schlosser said smoothly, her eyes scanning the messy office, lingering briefly on Chris's locked desk drawer. "Evidence suggesting the brake lines were intentionally severed. We are reopening the case as a homicide investigation, Mr. Gay." The room spun slightly. Homicide. Nancy had said Isis was the reason Mats was dead. Did Isis do it, and was now trying to frame someone else? Or did Nancy do it, and Isis was actually seeking justice? "And why are you here, Isis?" Chris asked, his voice hardening as he looked at the widow. Isis stood up, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. "Because, Chris, I know Matt's kept backups of his most prized work, specifically the San Miguel project. Zbynek Weber has been quite persistent in demanding those files from the estate. If you have them, Chris, you are withholding property that rightfully belongs to me as his sole heir." "I don't have them," Chris lied for the second time that hour, maintaining eye contact with Isis. "Matt's kept his private project separate. You know that." Isis stepped closer, the smell of expensive lilies wafting off her. "Mats was a thief, Chris. We both know he stole those initial concepts from Weber. If you are hiding them, you are making yourself a target. Weber is not a man who accepts no for an answer. Give them to me, and I can protect you." "I can't give you what I don't have," Chris said through gritted teeth. Detective Schlosser jotted something down in her notebook. "If you happen to remember anything, Mr. Gay, give me a call." She handed him a card. "Homicide investigations have a way of shaking secrets loose. Make sure you're on the right side of the law when they fall." As Isis and the detective left, Ukash let out a long breath. "Dude, what the hell was that about? Homicide? Stolen blueprints? Chris, what is going on?" "I need to make a phone call," Chris muttered, ignoring Ukash's panicked questions as he grabbed his jacket and headed right back out the door. He needed answers, and he knew only one person who lived in the city's underground who might have them. Leon Knudsen smelled like stale tobacco and cheap whiskey, a scent that perfectly matched the dive bar where Chris found him. Leon had been a private investigator, a fixer, and occasionally a drinking buddy of Matt's. If anyone knew the dark corners of Matt's life, it was Leon. Chris slid into the cracked leather booth across from the older man, signaling the bartender for 2 beers. "Chris Gay," Leon rasped, coughing into a napkin. "You look like a man who just found a ghost in his closet." "Worse," Chris said, leaning forward, keeping his voice low over the hum of the jukebox. "I found out my landlady used to sleep with Mats." Leon's bleary eyes suddenly sharpened. He set his glass down slowly. "Nancy? Nancy Kermakova? You know her?" Leon let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Everyone who matters knows the spider. That's what they call her in the circles Mats used to run in. You think she's just some eccentric old bird collecting rent on a Victorian teardown?" Chris swallowed hard. "What is she, Leon?" "She's a loan shark, Chris. A silent financier for high-end corporate espionage and illegal developments. She has half the city's zoning board in her pocket. Mats didn't just sleep with her. He borrowed heavily from her to fund his startup before you came along. When he couldn't pay, he promised her a cut of the San Miguel project, which, as we both know, he lifted from Zbynek Weber. The pieces were snapping together, forming a terrifying picture. She said she knew about the blueprints in my desk. If she knows they're there, she's letting you keep them for a reason," Leon warned, pointing a calloused finger at Chris. "Nancy is possessive. Obsessive. Mats tried to leave her for Isis, tried to cut her out of the Weber deal. Look where that got him. If Nancy is focusing her attention on you now, you need to pack a bag and disappear." Yesterday, Chris left the bar with his mind reeling. The spider. He thought of Nancy in her emerald robe, her cool fingers touching his arm, telling him she understood his darkness. She was manipulating him, isolating him. The thought of isolation brought a sudden, desperate ache for Ionalia. He pulled out his phone. He had practically shoved her away at the cafe, trying to protect her, but if Nancy and Weber were watching him, they already knew about her. Pushing her away wouldn't make her safe. It would only leave her confused and vulnerable. He didn't text. He went straight to her apartment building. When Ionalia opened her door, she was in sweatpants and an oversized college t-shirt, her hair tied up in a messy bun. Her eyes widened in surprise, then softened as she took in his drenched, exhausted appearance. "Chris." "I'm sorry," he blurted out, stepping into her doorway. "I'm so sorry about earlier. I lied to you. About the text, about Weber, about all of it. I was trying to keep you out of it, but I can't stop thinking about you, and I can't leave you in the dark." Ionalia didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm and pulled him inside, locking the deadbolt behind him. Her apartment was small, smelling of vanilla and old books, a stark contrast to the oppressive shadows of his own place. "Sit," she commanded, pushing him onto a plush, mustard-yellow sofa. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a towel, gently drying his damp hair. The intimacy of the gesture almost broke him. "Now, start from the beginning. No lies." And so he told her. He told her about Matt's, the stolen blueprints, Weber's threats, ISIS and Detective Schlosser, and finally, the terrifying truth about Nancy Kermakova. When he finished, silence hung heavily in the cozy room. Chris expected her to tell him to leave, to call the police, to run far away from his chaotic life. Instead, Ionalia sat beside him, their knees touching. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw. "You've been carrying this all alone for 3 years, she whispered, her tea-coloured eyes bright with unshed tears. "I didn't want to ruin this," Chris said, his voice breaking. "Us, whatever this is. The moment I met you, it was the first time I felt like I could actually breathe again. But they're watching us, Ionalia. Nancy sent me a photo of us at the cafe. She told me you don't understand my darkness, that I belong with her." "She's insane," Ionalia said fiercely. She leaned in, closing the distance between them. "And she's wrong." When she kissed him, it wasn't tentative. It was a fierce, grounding promise. Chris kissed her back, wrapping his arms tightly around her waist, anchoring himself to her warmth, her light, her absolute defiance of the shadows trying to consume him. For a moment, the world outside her apartment ceased to exist. There was only the taste of her, the soft rhythm of her breath, and the desperate hope that they could survive this. When they finally pulled apart, Chris rested his forehead against hers. "I have to get those blueprints," he said, reality crashing back in. "I need to get them out of my apartment before Nancy or Weber makes a move. I'll give them to Detective Schlosser. It's the only way to end this." "I'm coming with you," Ionalia said, standing up. "No," Chris said firmly. "Absolutely not. Nancy's building is her territory. I need to know you are safe here. Lock the door, don't let anyone in." He kissed her one last time, drawing strength from it, and headed back out into the night to face the spider. The Victorian building loomed like a haunted monolith against the night sky, its dark windows reflecting the street lamps like empty, staring eyes. Chris kept his head down, clutching the lapels of his coat as he hurried up the front steps. Before he could put his key in the heavy oak door, a figure stepped out from the deep shadows of the porch. Chris jumped back, his heart leaping into his throat. It was a woman, but not Nancy. She was built like a heavyweight fighter, wearing a black leather jacket and a flat cap. She moved with terrifying, predatory grace, pinning Chris against the brick wall before he could even cry out for help. A cold, metallic pressure pressed against his ribs. A knife. "Chris Gay," the woman rasped, her breath smelling of peppermint and stale coffee. "Ivor Pike. Mr. Weber sent me. He's tired of waiting for his property." "I don't know," Chris gasped, struggling against her grip, but she was impossibly strong. "Shut up," Ivor hissed, digging the point of the blade slightly through his coat. "Isis Warren went crying to the cops, stirring up the mud. Weber doesn't like mud. You have 24 hours to bring the San Miguel files to the Zenith Architecture lobby. If you don't, I'm going to pay a visit to that pretty little girl with the tea-coloured eyes. Understood?" Chris froze, pure rage and terror warring in his chest. "If you touch her—" Suddenly, the heavy oak door swung open with a loud creak. Golden light spilled onto the porch, catching the glint of Ivor's knife. Standing in the doorway was Nancy. She was wearing a floor-length crimson velvet gown, her hair perfectly styled, holding a heavy, antique brass fireplace poker casually in one hand. "Excuse me," Nancy said, her voice echoing with an icy, authoritative boom that sent shivers down Chris's spine. "You are trespassing on my property. Take your hands off my tenant." Ivor sneered, not moving. "Back off, old lady. This doesn't concern you." Nancy smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Chris had ever seen. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She simply took a step forward, raising the brass poker slightly. "Ivor Pike, isn't it? Spinex's little attack dog. Tell your master that if he sends his strays to soil my front porch again, I will have the zoning board condemn his new high-rise project before they pour the foundation. Now, let him go or I will beat you to death on these steps. And the police will thank me for defending my home." Eva stared at Nancy for a long, tense moment. The older woman's eyes were dead, devoid of fear or bluff. Slowly, Ivor lowered the knife and stepped back, releasing Chris. 24 hours, Gay. Ivor spat before turning and disappearing into the rainy night. Chris leaned against the brick wall, gasping for air. Nancy turned to him, her terrifying aura melting instantly into a mask of maternal concern. She dropped the poker and reached out, her cool hands framing his face. "Oh, Chris," she cooed, checking him for injuries. "Look what they've done to you. The world out there is so savage, so cruel. I told you, didn't I? You are only safe here, with me." Chris felt a surge of revulsion. He pulled away from her touch, stepping through the doorway. "Did you send her? Was this a setup to make me trust you?" Nancy looked genuinely hurt, pressing a hand to her chest. "Chris, I saved you. I've been watching the street all night, waiting for you to come home safely. Go upstairs. Lock your door. I'll make us some tea and bring it up." Chris didn't wait. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his mind racing. Nancy was dangerous, but Weber was actively threatening Ionelia. He needed the blueprints now. He needed leverage. He burst into his apartment and froze. The space felt wrong. It wasn't tossed or destroyed, but things were shifted. The books on his coffee table were slightly out of alignment. A throw pillow was flipped. And the fake dictionary on his bookshelf, the one hiding the drawer key, was pushed an inch to the left. Someone had been in here. Nancy. It had to be Nancy. She had a spare key. He rushed to the bookshelf, yanking the fake dictionary down. The key was still inside. He rushed to his small, battered desk. The lock on the bottom drawer showed faint, fresh scratch marks, as if someone had tried to pick it and failed, or perhaps had used the key and clumsily relocked it. Hands shaking, Chris inserted the key. It turned with a satisfying click. He pulled the heavy drawer open. There, sitting exactly where he had left them 3 years ago, were the thick, rolled-up blueprints of the San Miguel project. They hadn't been stolen. But sitting on top of the blueprints was something new, something that made Chris's blood run completely cold. It was an envelope, sealed with red wax. His name, Chris, was written across the front in a messy, chaotic scrawl he instantly recognized. It was Mats's handwriting. Chris tore the envelope open, pulling out a single sheet of heavily creased paper. The letter was dated 3 days before Mats's fatal car crash. "Chris, if you're reading this, I am dead, and Nancy finally won. I was a fool to think I could play her and Weber against each other. The blueprints are fake, Chris. I designed them with fatal structural flaws to ruin Weber when he stole them. But Nancy found out. She wants to use them to collapse Zenith architecture from the inside. Don't trust the spider. She doesn't just own my debts, she sabotaged my car. And if you have this, she's planning to frame you for it. I'm sorry, kid. Mats." The paper fluttered from Chris's hands to the floor, just as a soft, rhythmic knocking echoed from his apartment door. "Chris?" Nancy's smooth voice drifted through the wood. "I have your tea. Let me in." "Chris!" The knock came again, slightly louder this time, the rhythmic, impatient tap of manicured fingernails against the old wood. "The tea is getting cold, dear." Chris stared at the letter on the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird throwing itself against the bars of a cage. "She sabotaged my car. And if you have this, she's planning to frame you for it." Mats's final warning echoed in his ears, a chilling validation of every panicked instinct that had screamed at him to run, since the moment Nancy had let herself into his room. The walls of the Victorian apartment, with their faded floral wallpaper and heavy oak trim, suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb closing in around him. He had been sleeping under the roof of a murderer for 3 years. He moved with frantic, silent precision. He snatched the letter from the floor, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly tore the brittle paper. He folded it twice, shoving it deep into his trouser pocket where it burned against his leg like a brand. He slammed the heavy drawer of his desk shut, listening for the heavy metallic click of the lock, and quickly slid the fake dictionary back into its exact place on the shelf, perfectly aligned with the dust rings. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing his lungs to expand, and smoothed his terrified expression into what he desperately hoped looked like exhausted relief. He unlocked the door and pulled it open. Nancy stood in the hallway, the emerald silk of her robe catching the dim, flickering bulb of the corridor. She held a heavy silver tray bearing a delicate porcelain teapot and 2 matching cups, the china so thin it was nearly translucent. Steam curled into the cold air, carrying the heavy, cloying scent of chamomile. But beneath the floral notes lay something sweeter, a chemical astringency that smelled undeniably artificial and deeply wrong. "You lock your door against me, Chris?" she asked, a dangerous, theatrical pout playing on her dark red lips. "After I just saved you from Weber's street trash?" I was just startled," Chris stammered, stepping aside to let her in, keeping his eyes averted to hide the terror he knew was swimming in them. "Thank you, Nancy, for earlier. I don't know what I would have done. She caught me off guard." "You would have been hurt," she said simply, her voice devoid of any real empathy. She glided into the room, her movements smooth and rehearsed, and set the tray on the small coffee table. She turned to face him, her dark eyes scanning his pale face with a predatory intensity that made his skin crawl. "But you are safe here. I have always told you that. I will always protect what is mine." Chris swallowed hard, fighting a visceral urge to flinch away as she reached out to straighten his collar. Her touch, which he had once thought of as eccentric but maternal, now felt like the icy brush of a spider's legs testing the vibrations of its web. "Sit," she commanded softly, gesturing to the sofa. "Drink your tea. You look like a ghost." Chris sat on the very edge of the cushions, his muscles coiled tight, watching as she poured the amber liquid. The sweet, chemical scent was overpowering now, filling the small room and making his stomach turn. If she was planning to frame him for Mats's murder, if she had planted that letter hoping the police would find it during a raid after tipping them off, she needed him subdued. She needed him unconscious. Or worse. She handed him the fragile cup, her fingers brushing his. "Drink." He brought the hot rim to his lips, his mind racing through a dozen impossible scenarios. He couldn't refuse without immediately making her suspicious, but he certainly couldn't swallow a drop of whatever poison she had brewed. He pretended to take a long sip, letting the scalding liquid pool in the front of his mouth. It tasted bitter and chalky beneath the honey. He subtly shifted the cup to obscure his mouth, holding his breath as he gently spat the tea back into the dark depths of the porcelain, pretending to swallow with a loud gulp. "Good," Nancy murmured, a look of profound satisfaction washing over her as she sat in the armchair opposite him. "You need rest, Chris. You've let yourself get tangled up in things you simply don't understand." Mats was a fool. A brilliant architect perhaps, but a fool of a man. He thought he could outsmart Weber, and worse, he thought he could outsmart me. But you are sweeter, more malleable. You appreciate the quiet. Chris feigned a heavy blink, letting his shoulders slump dramatically into the cushions. "What happened to Mats, Nancy?" he asked, intentionally slurring his words just a fraction, letting his chin drop toward his chest. A cruel, triumphant smile ghosted across her elegant face, a mask of sanity finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. "Mats drove too fast. He lived too fast. He thought he could run away with ISIS and leave me holding his worthless debts. His brakes failed. Tragic, really." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hypnotic, soothing whisper. "But we don't need to think about Mats anymore, darling. Tomorrow, I will handle the little widow, ISIS, and I will ruin Zbynek Weber. I will secure the San Miguel files and we will finally be at peace, just you and me, in this beautiful house safe from the ugly world." Chris let his head loll slightly to the side, his eyes fluttering shut, fighting the massive spike of adrenaline screaming through his veins. "Tired," he mumbled, letting his arm drop limply to his side. "I know, darling," Nancy cooed, rising from her chair. She stepped over to him, gently taking the supposedly empty cup from his limp hand. Her fingers brushed through his hair in a sickeningly tender caress. "Sleep now. Let me take care of everything. She walked to the door, giving his feigned sleeping form one last lingering look of absolute, terrifying possession before slipping out. She pulled the door shut, and Chris heard the chilling, metallic thud of the exterior deadbolts sliding into place. She was locking him in. Chris waited 30 agonizing seconds, counting every beat of his racing heart, listening to the soft padding of her footsteps fade down the wooden stairs. The moment he was absolutely sure she had reached the ground floor, he sprang from the sofa, moving with desperate silence. He didn't have much time. The drug she had put in the tea, whatever heavy sedative it was, meant she expected him to be dead to the world until morning. If she heard him moving, she would return. He grabbed the fake dictionary, retrieved the key, and unlocked the drawer for the final time. He didn't just take the heavy cardboard tube containing the blueprints. He grabbed his passport, a stash of emergency cash he kept hidden in a sock, and his laptop. He shoved everything haphazardly into his waterproof messenger bag, buckling it tight. The main door was locked from the outside, but the rusted fire escape window wasn't. Chris threw the sash up, the cold, driving rain immediately blowing in and soaking his shirt. He scrambled out onto the rusted iron grating, the descent a slippery, terrifying blur of cold metal and darkness. His boots slid on the wet iron rungs. His hands scraped raw, but he didn't slow down. When his boots finally hit the cracked pavement of the alleyway, splashing into a deep puddle, he didn't look back at the dark, looming silhouette of the Victorian house. He ran blindly into the stormy night, his hand pressed firmly against the pocket holding Mats's final letter. He knew exactly where he had to go and who he had to trust. The main lobby of Zenith Architecture was a monument to modern wealth and corporate intimidation. Soaring glass walls stretched 3 stories high, white marble floors gleamed like ice, and an imposing brushed steel security desk sat in the center, looking more like a military checkpoint than a reception area. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the storm had broken, and the lobby was buzzing with high-end corporate life, men in tailored suits and women with ruthless briefcases. Chris stood half-hidden by a towering indoor ficus tree, feeling entirely out of place. His clothes were completely dry but stiff and wrinkled from the rain. His hair was a chaotic mess, and his eyes were bloodshot from a sleepless night spent pacing a police precinct holding room. Yet, despite his disheveled appearance, his jaw was set with a hard, unfamiliar resolve. The fear that had ruled him for 3 years was gone, burned away by the truth. Beside him stood Detective Maureen Schlosser. Her severe bob was perfectly in place, her tailored trench coat impeccable. Her icy blue eyes scanned the massive room with clinical, predator-like detachment. 2 plainclothes officers stood discreetly near the revolving glass doors, blending seamlessly into the morning rush, reading newspapers they didn't care about. "You're absolutely sure about this, Mr. Gay?" Schlosser asked softly, not looking at him. "We have Matt San Miguel's letter. We have the lab expediting the residue in that teacup you brought us. We can arrest Chermakova at her house right now. We have enough for a warrant." "Nancy is a spider," Chris replied, his voice raspy but steady. "If you corner her in her own web, she'll find a way out. She knows every shadow in that house, and she'll have half the precinct's brass on her payroll by noon. We need all of them in one bright public room. Weber, Isis, Nancy. We let them corner each other over the prize, and then you pull the net shut where they can't hide." Schlosser considered his logic for a moment, then gave a sharp, definitive nod. "All right, it's your play, but you stay behind me the second weapons are drawn." Right on cue, the silver doors of the executive elevator bank slid open with a soft, melodic ding. Zbynek Weber stepped out into the lobby, flanked immediately by the terrifying, leather-clad bulk of Ivor Pike. Weber looked impeccable in a navy pinstripe suit, holding a steaming espresso in a porcelain cup, looking every bit the king of his glass castle. "Mr. Weber!" Chris called out loudly, stepping out from the shadow of the ficus tree and into the center of the marble floor. Weber stopped dead, his coffee splashing slightly. His dark eyes narrowed in disgust as he took in Chris's ruined clothes. He glanced sideways at Ivor, who subtly shifted her weight into a fighter's stance, slipping her right hand inside her heavy leather jacket. "Chris Gay," Weber said smoothly, recovering his composure, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You look terrible. I assume you're here because you've finally decided to be reasonable regarding my stolen property?" "I brought the blueprints," Chris said, tapping the thick, worn cardboard tube protruding from his messenger bag. "But they aren't yours, Weber, and they never belonged to Matt's either. Before Weber could issue a threat, the massive revolving doors spun violently. Isis Warren marched into the lobby looking like a storm cloud in a black designer trench coat, her stiletto heels clicking like literal gunshots against the marble. "Spyneck!" she hissed venomously, ignoring Chris entirely as she closed the distance. "Your corporate thugs are harassing my estate lawyers. I told you yesterday I am the sole heir to—" "Quiet, Isis!" Weber snapped, his cultivated veneer cracking to reveal the ugly, desperate greed beneath. He looked back at Chris, stepping closer. "Hand the tube over, Gay. Now, before I let Iva finish the lesson she started on your porch last night." "Oh, I really don't think you want those, Spyneck." The voice, dripping with dark amusement and absolute malice, echoed across the marble lobby, freezing the blood in Chris's veins. It was Nancy. She stood just inside the revolving doors, wearing a flawless grey trench coat over the same crimson velvet gown from the night before. She looked perfectly composed, an aristocrat slumming it among peasants, but when her dead eyes locked onto Chris, the absolute unhinged fury burning within them was terrifying. She had woken up to find her cage empty. "Nancy," Weber said, taking an involuntary step back, his arrogant posture faltering. "What in God's name are you doing here? This is corporate business, not one of your back-alley shakedowns." "This is my business," Nancy said, walking slowly, deliberately toward the center of the group. She didn't even glance at Schlosser, who had stepped slightly behind a thick, structural pillar. "Chris, my sweet darling, you've been a very, very naughty boy, sneaking out the window like a thief in the night, taking things that do not belong to you." "Those designs belong to Mats," Isis interjected fiercely, stepping between Nancy and Weber, "which means they belong to me to sell." Nancy laughed, a harsh, grating, ugly sound that startled several passing office workers. "You stupid, arrogant little girl, Mats despised you. He only married you because you were young, naive, and dumb enough to sign as a guarantor on his massive personal loans. The blueprints belong to me. He promised them to me to clear his debts before you ever batted your eyelashes at him." "The foundational math is mine!" Weber roared, completely losing his temper, his face turning a mottled red. "He stole the core algorithmic calculations from my secure servers. It's Zenith property." "Yes, he did steal them," Chris said loudly, his voice cutting through the billionaire shouting match. He pulled the heavy cardboard tube from his bag, unscrewing the plastic cap. He slid the heavy, blue-lined parchment out, unfurling it across a sleek, glass-topped display table nearby so the incredibly complex architectural schematics were visible to everyone. Weber lunged forward immediately, his eyes hungry, but Chris threw an arm out, stopping him. "But he didn't just steal them, Weber," Chris said, his voice trembling slightly with adrenaline, but loud enough to carry to the rafters. "He changed them. Mats knew Nancy was going to take these files to ruin you, so he booby-trapped the entire design from the ground up. Look closely at the load-bearing calculations for the central atrium. Look at the foundation depth." Weber frowned deeply, his irritation momentarily overridden by his pure architectural instincts. He stepped closer, pulling a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket. He squinted at the fine print, his eyes tracking the complex math. Suddenly, the breath left Weber's lungs in a harsh hiss. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and grey. "My God," Weber breathed, leaning heavily against the glass table. "The sheer stress. The foundational load is misdirected by a factor of 3 degrees. If we built this, if we actually constructed this, the entire structural integrity of the West Wing would collapse under its own massive weight within 6 months." Chris finished grimly. "It's a slow-motion guillotine, a death trap. He designed it specifically to destroy your company, Weber," Chris continued, looking at Nancy. "And Nancy knew. She knew the math was fatal. She was going to let you build it. She was going to let hundreds of innocent people die in a collapse just to bankrupt you, ruin your legacy, and buy your corporate assets for pennies on the dollar." Nancy's aristocratic mask finally, permanently shattered, her beautiful face contorted into an unimaginably ugly, feral snarl. "You ungrateful little rat! I gave you a home. I should have killed you myself instead of trying to frame you for that idiot's car crash. Iva, get the plans. Kill him if you have to." Eva lunged forward with terrifying speed, pulling a serrated hunting knife from her jacket. But before she could cross the marble floor, Detective Schlosser stepped out from behind the pillar. Her service weapon was drawn, leveled squarely and unblinkingly at Iva's chest. "Police! Drop the weapon! Drop it now!" Schlosser barked, her voice a whip crack of authority. The two plainclothes officers rushed forward from the doors, their weapons also drawn, flanking the group. The lobby instantly erupted into sheer chaos as innocent corporate bystanders screamed, dropped their coffees, and dove behind modern art installations for cover. Eva froze, looking at the three guns trained on her. Slowly, calculatingly, she dropped the knife, letting it clatter loudly against the marble, and raised her hands. Isis screamed, backing away in sheer panic, tripping over her own heels. Weber stood frozen, utterly paralyzed, staring blankly at the cursed blueprints that had nearly erased his empire and his freedom. But Nancy didn't raise her hands. She ignored the police entirely. She turned her dead, dark, obsessive eyes solely on Chris. "She doesn't love you, Chris," Nancy whispered venomously, her voice somehow slicing through the screaming lobby. "That little girl doesn't know what you are. You'll always belong to the shadows. You'll always belong to me." "No," Chris said, standing tall, his voice incredibly steady for the first time in 3 long years. "I don't, and I never did." As the officers aggressively cuffed Nancy and Eva, pressing them against the glass walls and reading them their rights, Chris calmly rolled the fatal blueprints back up. He handed the tube to Schlosser, along with Matz's confession letter. He turned his back on the wreckage of his past, ignoring Nancy's sudden, shrill screaming, and walked out through the revolving doors. He stepped out into the bright, clear morning light, taking his first truly free breath. The news hit the city's architectural and real estate sectors like a localized, devastating earthquake. The very public arrest of Nancy Kermakova in the lobby of Zenith Architecture blew the lid off a massive underground syndicate of zoning blackmail, political extortion, and lethal corporate espionage. The handwritten letter Chris provided to Detective Schlosser, swiftly authenticated by forensic handwriting experts, officially changed Matt San Miguel's death from an unfortunate mechanical accident to premeditated murder. Zbynek Weber's massive firm was immediately placed under intense, paralyzing federal investigation for the initial theft of the core designs, as well as his undeniable association with Ivor Pike's violent strong-arm tactics. Zenith stock plummeted overnight. Isis Warren's assets were frozen entirely as federal authorities investigated exactly how much she knew about Matz's fraudulent loans and her own complicity in Nancy's web. For an exhausting week, Chris was buried deep within the fluorescent purgatory of police precincts. He gave endless statements, identified seized evidence, and relived the 3-year nightmare over and over again for relentless teams of lawyers and detectives. He had temporarily moved his drafting table and his few surviving possessions into Ukash's cramped, messy living room. He was entirely unable to stomach the thought of ever returning to the Victorian house, which was now wrapped tightly in bright yellow police crime scene tape, its dark windows finally empty. Ukash blessedly asked very few questions. He seemed to sense the profound weight his friend was carrying, simply keeping the coffee pot perpetually full, ordering too much takeout, and successfully finishing the local bakery renovation project entirely on his own, while Chris dealt with the massive legal fallout. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky bruised a deep, beautiful purple with dusk, when Chris finally felt he could truly breathe again. The police had cleared him of all suspicion, labeling him a vital witness. He stood outside a familiar apartment door, his heart pounding a different, much lighter rhythm. He clutched a small bouquet of bright yellow tulips, the exact same color as the raincoat she had worn on the day everything exploded. He knocked gently. The door opened almost instantly, as if she had been waiting by it. Ionelia stood there wearing a soft, oversized grey sweater, her hair falling loosely and naturally around her shoulders. The dark, tired circles under her tea-coloured eyes mirrored his own, a silent, painful testament to the terrifying, uncertain days they had spent apart, while Chris untangled the violent web of his past. "Chris," she breathed, her hand flying up to cover her mouth, her eyes welling with instant tears. "It's over," he said, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. He offered the yellow tulips awkwardly. "I know I have a massive amount of explaining to do, and an ocean of apologizing. I brought a terrifying, dangerous world straight to your doorstep, Ionelia, and if you want me to walk away right now so you can have a normal, safe life, I promise you I will turn around." Ionelia didn't look at the flowers. She looked deeply into his eyes, searching his face. She was looking for the deep-seated fear that had haunted him since the day they met, the shadow that had always lurked behind his smile. Finding only exhaustion and a desperate, beautiful hope, she stepped forward. She wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, and pulled him fiercely against her. "Don't you ever threaten to walk away from me again, Chris Gay," she whispered fiercely, her tears soaking into his jacket. Chris dropped the flowers, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in her hair. The sweet, grounding scent of vanilla and old paper washed over him, anchoring him completely to the present moment. The cold, suffocating grip of Nancy's obsession, the lingering, toxic guilt over Max's death, the pure terror of Weber's threats, it all finally fractured and dissolved completely in the sheer warmth of her embrace. They moved inside, locking the deadbolt behind them, shutting out the city. They sat on the plush, mustard-yellow sofa, and for hours they just talked. Chris told her every single detail, the grueling police interviews, the mountain of evidence, and the final pathetic look of absolute hatred on Nancy's face as she was dragged away. He poured out every ounce of the darkness he had been carrying for years, and instead of running from it, Ionelia simply held his hand tightly, absorbing the weight of it with him, proving Nancy entirely wrong. "What happens now?" she asked softly, hours later, tracing the calloused lines of his palm with her thumb. "Ukash and I are fully rebranding," Chris smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. "No more massive, soul-crushing corporate contracts. No more chasing zenith. We're sticking to bakeries, community centers, residential homes, honest, quiet work. And I have to find a new apartment." Ionelia looked slowly around her small, cozy space, a bright, playful glint finally returning to her tea-colored eyes. "Well, my lease is actually up in 3 months, and I hear architects are exceptionally good at maximizing small, shared floor plans." Chris felt a sudden, blindingly bright flare of joy expand in his chest. It was a terrifying prospect, opening himself up to someone this completely, trusting someone with his life. But looking at Ionelia, he knew without a doubt he was ready. He leaned in, kissing her deeply, sealing a silent promise of a future built not on stolen secrets, hidden blueprints, or obsessive control, but on truth, light, and the enduring strength of a love that had survived the deepest dark. For the first time in a very long time, Chris Gay knew exactly where he belonged. Chris's terrifying journey from a trapped tenant suffocating in a web of deceit to a man finally stepping into the light alongside Ionelia proves that the darkest, most dangerous secrets simply can't survive the truth. Nancy's terrifying, obsessive control ultimately became the exact trap that was her own undoing, while Chris found the incredible strength to reclaim his agency, his career, and his future. Their story is a thrilling, pulse-pounding reminder that we absolutely do not have to be defined by the shadows of our past, especially when we are lucky enough to find someone willing to hold our hand in the dark. Did Nancy's deeply terrifying obsession give you chills? What did you think of Max's brilliant, architecturally booby-trapped revenge from beyond the grave? Let me know your absolute favorite twist in the comments below. If you enjoyed this emotional, suspenseful ride, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends who love a good thriller romance, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales.